Hi class, and welcome to your next video on evidence for evolution. So we want to begin here with Darwin and what he believed and where we actually find evidence for evolution. So he argued that the living things have been evolving for millions of years. There's lots of evidence to the process. So when we look at this, we see the fossil record, we see where we actually have the different organisms. We see what are called homologous structures, and we see similarities in early development and embryology. So let's go through these and kind of look at what this evidence is. So the first thing is the fossil record. So everyone knows what a fossil is, and Darwin actually used fossils as part of the history of life on Earth. And he actually compared those fossils to use in his theory of evolution. So by comparing fossils from older layers of rocks lower in the earth with the younger layers, scientists document that life has changed, and we actually document those small changes, but we also document those big changes over time. So we have what are called these special type of fossils called transitional fossils. A transitional fossil is the fossilized remains of a life form that exhibits traits of common to both an ancestral group and a derived descendant group. Basically what that means, so a fish actually came from an amphibian. And when that fish came from that amphibian, it used to have 4 legs. So we look to see these ancestral fossils and where they are. So the formation of a fossil, how it occurs, the organism is going to die, and the remains decay and go into the ground, and the decayed parts of the remains are replaced with minerals, specifically a mineral called silica. Silica then hardens into limestone and leaves an impression in softer limestone, creating the fossil. So if we look here, these are 2 fossils. The dinosaur one is actually a very famous fossil, and it is located in Chicago, and it is one of the biggest dinosaur fossils that we have. Its name is Sue, and Sue is actually a female T-Rex, and she was found quite a few years ago, but lots of scientists use these different fossils to see how our organisms are changing. So the next thing we have is the homologous body structures. A homologous structure is an example of an organ or bone that appeared in different animals underlying any anatomical commonalities demonstrating a descent from a common ancestor. Basically what this means, it's when different animals have bones that appear very similar in form or function and seem to be related. So for animals, we look at their legs or their arms, and we compare it to a lot of different organisms. So a turtle, an alligator, a bird, and a mammal all have the same type of bones in their forearms. Or for us, just our regular arms. And you can see highlighted in this picture, the purple is the same type of bone, the yellow is the same type of bone, the blue, and so on and so forth. So we look at these, even though they're different in shape, they all serve kind of the same function. And since they serve the same function, we look at them as homologous structures. Here's another one where we're looking at actually the human arm with a cat forearm, a whale flipper, and a bat wing. And they all have the exact same bones. We even call them exactly the same thing: a humerus, a radius, an ulna, carpals, metacarpals, and phalanges. And as you can see, they do have different purposes. Evolutionarily, we've used these different bones in order to create the purpose that we need them for. And so we do see different shapes as well. So homologous structures serve important functions, but not all of these homologous functions are going to serve an important function. The organs of many animals are reduced in size and are sometimes called vestiges, or traces of homologous organs in other species. This is called a vestigial organ. Your appendix is a vestigial organ. We also, when we're growing embryo in utero, we have a tail, and that is also a vestigial organ. So the next thing we want to look at is similarities in embryology. So the early stages or embryos of many animals with backbones are very, very similar. The same groups of embryonic cells develop in the same order and in similar patterns to produce the tissues and organs of all vertebrates. So when we look at the man, the pig, the reptile, and the bird, they all have very similar structure. They all have a tail. They all have pharyngeal slits. They all have the same kind of head shape. And you can see the vertebrae in all of them. So there are lots of similarities in the embryos. If we look at the fish as compared to the turtle, salamander, and human, in the very beginning, they look very similar. And then they start to get their new differences, which then lead to the completely different organisms that they are. So the next thing is molecular biology. Molecular biology is the comparisons of the DNA and amino acid sequence between different organisms, which reveal the evolutionary relationships. So all living things share a common DNA code for proteins found in living things. We share genes with bacteria, yeast, and fruit flies. Doesn't matter. So another thing to consider is, remember, we've talked about that populations are our units of evolution, not individuals. So the gene pool is the total collection of genes in a population at any one time. And we must remember that variation must exist for natural selection to take place. So we have two things. Microevolution is a change in relative frequencies of alleles. Remember, we already talked about how alleles change in a gene pool over time. And population genetics is the study of how populations change genetically over time. So we have mutations in sexual reproduction, which is going to help with this change. And mutation, or the change in the nucleotide sequence of the DNA, is the ultimate source of our new allele, which we can look at and we can see that we actually have this change. And the last thing is sexual reproduction shuffles the alleles to produce new combinations of homologous chromosomes, and they sort during anaphase 1 of meiosis. During prophase 1 of meiosis, the pairs exchange and crossover, and the further variation arises when the sperm randomly unites with the eggs in fertilization. So, evolutionary theory. Scientific advances in many fields of biology, geology, physics have confirmed and expanded most of Darwin's hypotheses. Evolutionary theory continues to change as new data is gathered and new ways of thinking arise. So the big ones that I want you to consider here, I want you really to think about the homologous structures. If there's a vestigial organ, I want you to think about the fossil record, where the fossil might have been found. Was it earlier? Was it later? I want you to think about the molecular genetic evidence, and I want you to think about all of that and come up with what this evidence for evolution was. Okay, make sure you got lots of good pictures, lots of notes, and we will talk about this in class.